Do you ever wonder how one time period can be so different from another and how they change? Well, today our question is going to be, how did challenges in Europe lead to the end of the medieval era? In this lesson, it's our goal to learn why the Middle Ages came to an end. To answer that, first we're going to explain how climate changes led to famine, and then we're going to describe the events surrounding the Black Death. And then finally, we're going to explain the causes and the effects of the 100 Years' War. As we move through this lesson together, there are some vocabulary words that I want you to listen for. First is your academic word, which is intermittently, and then your domain-specific words, words like famine, life expectancy, nationalism, plague, and pandemic. Remember that if you ever have trouble with any of these words, you can always rely on your glossary. Our lesson question is, how did challenges in Europe lead to the end of the medieval era? To answer that question, first we want to look at the factors that ended the Middle Ages. Some of these factors are famine, the Great Plague, and then also the 100 Years' War. But first, let's briefly talk about the one that you're probably most familiar with. Let's just mention the plague for a moment. Here's a placard from a port city in England where the plague was rumored to have entered. It says the Black Death entered England in 1348 through this port. It killed 30 to 50% of the country's total population. How can one pandemic or one sickness wipe out that many people? We're going to be talking about that more in today's lesson. Our lesson question is, how did challenges in Europe lead to the end of the medieval era? To answer that question, today we're looking at factors that ended the Middle Ages. And to start, we're going to take a look at famine. Now let's talk about Europe's population in the 1300s. Let's take a look at this graph on your screen together. Well, you can see that Europe's population doubled between the year 1000 and 1340, but then all of a sudden we have this sharp decrease in population. Let's explore what the reasons for that were. Well, an increased number of people were living in the towns and the cities. The manor system was dissolving at this time. Why were they moving to the cities? Well, it's because the number of merchants, craftsmen, and the free peasants were rising. People were moving to the cities to sell their wares and also to purchase more items. Also, warm weather resulted in increased food production. When the people are well fed, it allows populations to rise. People aren't getting sick. People are able to raise families more efficiently and effectively. But then all of a sudden, we have this sharp downturn. The reason for this was the Little Ice Age, and the time period between 1300 and 1850 is called the Little Ice Age. Take a look at this picture here. You can see the people walking out on these little glaciers right here. And scientists don't know what caused this climactic event or this climate event, and its effects were more pronounced in certain areas, especially in parts across Europe. Now, during this time, famine was widespread. What is famine? Famine is when the crops start to go bad and you don't have enough food to feed all of the people. Well, the Great Famine was between 1315 and 1317 during this Little Ice Age. What happened was that cooler summer temperatures here resulted in a shorter growing season. When you have a shorter growing season, you can't produce enough food. Also, there was heavy rains and flooding, which also impacted these crops. And there was a decline in food production. When you don't have enough food to feed everyone, it allows for the prices of what is available to go up. Not everyone could afford to eat. And this really affected Europe most of all because there were those larger populations that were happening beforehand. So when everyone can't afford to eat, what happens is famine. And when you don't have enough food and there's a famine, you start to get sick, there's malnourishment, people start to get diseased, starvation is present, and all of a sudden your population starts to decline very, very rapidly. Now let's take a look at this graphic organizer together and talk about some of the cause and effect. Well, one of the causes was an increase in crop failures, and its effect led to an increased frequency of famine. And some of the things that happen when there's a famine is that there's starvation and malnutrition, a lower resistance to disease. The people started to get sick. There's higher death rates and a lower life expectancy, which is how long you can anticipate you're going to live. There was also social unrest, as I'm sure you can imagine. When the people get sick and people start to die, the rest of the population becomes very upset, and there's a lot of social unrest. Malnutrition is not enough nutrition to meet your body's needs. You need something to be able to ward off all of this disease that's going around, and the people started to die. Your lesson question, once again, is how did challenges in Europe lead to the end of the medieval era? Well, we just started answering our question a little bit when we looked at famine and how it shortened life expectancies and how the people were starving and they were weak and they were not able to fight diseases. Remember when I said now would be a really bad time for a big disease to start coming through the area? Now let's take a look at when that actually happened and the Great Plague came through. The Black Death was a plague, and a plague is a disease that takes over a large area very quickly. It swept through Europe beginning in the 1300s. The cause was bacteria that was being carried by fleas that attached themselves to rats. Now, there were so many trade routes and so many opportunities for these rats who had these bubonic plague attached fleas to them to hop on different ships and travel all through Europe, thereby spreading the plague. The symptoms of the plague included sores, fever, chills, dark spots on the skin, and it would eventually lead to death. If we take a look at these pie charts over here, bubonic plague is what is spread to humans from animals, and it attacks the lymph nodes. If you contract bubonic plague, you have about a 50% chance of survival. Now, pneumonic plague attacks the lungs, and it can be spread through the air, either by someone coughing or somebody sneezing. The Black Death actually comprised both of these types of plague, so you can imagine how it was able to wipe out such a large piece of the population. Now, where did it start? Well, I told you that these rats carrying these infected fleas went through the trade routes. The Great Plague, the Black Plague, began in China, and trade brought the plague to Europe. The first outbreaks occurred in Sicily, and then it spread across the continent of Europe over the next few years. If we take a look over here at this map, we can see how it started. It started down in Asia, and through these trade routes, don't forget to always reference your legend over here, but we can see how it traveled from Asia up, and you can look at the colors, and as it color coats itself, you can see how it moves upward over several years, and it infects a large piece of Europe. So what were the causes of the plague? Well, remember I mentioned that people thought that the devil was inside you or had something to do with it. They weren't really good at being able to tell exactly why diseases happen. So the cause of the plague was not understood, and so all treatment attempts were unsuccessful. So what that does is it leads to a panic where people become irrational. And many groups, especially the Jews, were persecuted. They were blamed for the disease. They saw that God was punishing them. Some viewed the plague as a punishment from God or a sign of the end of the world. They thought that God had abandoned them. So confidence in social institutions also weakened. For example, the church. A lot of clergy members were dying. So there wasn't anyone to lead them. And also, they thought God had abandoned them. They thought God had left them. Imagine what it would be like if a wide-scale plague like this hit every aspect of a society. Your doctors aren't immune to it. There's no one to treat you because they've all died of the same thing. Perhaps your monarchy is falling because they've also contracted the plague. Now, some of the other effects of the plague, about 35% of the European population actually died. High death rates led to labor shortages. There's not anyone to work if everybody's at home dying. Also, economic productivity declined, as did trade. Again, merchants aren't making their wares. Nobody is selling their wares. People are not out shaking hands and trading with one another because they might contract the plague. Prices rose as goods became scarce. We talked about that back when we were speaking about the famine. Remember, if there's less of something, the price is going to go up. and faith in religion declined. Remember those social institutions. So think of these effects as we're answering our lesson question about when the medieval period actually ended. There have been other epidemics throughout history, and they affect global populations. For instance, the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 killed between 20 and 40 million people all across the world. And today, more than 200 million people are infected with malaria, and about 650,000 out of that 200 million die every year. We're really close to answering our lesson question, which is how did challenges in Europe lead to the end of the medieval era? And when we started to see some of the signs of the end of times, when we talked about the famine and the Little Ice Age, and when we talked about the Great Plague and how it killed between 30 and 50% of the population of Europe. Now let's take a look at another cause of the end of the medieval era, the 100 Years' War fought between England and France. How did the 100 Years' War get started? Well, Edward III of England claimed the French throne following the death of the king. Well, the French declared that King Philip VI of France was going to be king. They didn't want to be ruled by a foreigner, especially an Englishman. So the two countries fought intermittently, means they'd fight for a while, they'd take a break for a while, they'd go back to fighting. And they fought that way between 1337 and 1453. Well, England was victorious very early, reclaiming territory in northern France. You can see this artistic depiction here of the English, you can see their flag right there, riding in on the French. Well, England actually employed thousands of peasants in its army. Why did they do this? Well, because the peasants were actually very skilled at archery, using a bow and an arrow. Now, many of them were talented archers who easily defeated the French knights. Why were they able to do this? Well, the knights were on horseback. They had swords, they had crossbows, but they were ineffective at long range. Now, these English peasants, they had longbows. Take a look at this picture over here. You can see the longbows here, and they had arrows that were about 3 feet long, which meant that they could travel much longer distances. So they didn't have to be close. They could still accurately shoot someone from a far distance, which rendered these knights ineffective. So at Agincourt, Henry V's 6,000 troops defeated a French force of 30,000. And what this did was a bunch of peasants defeated an entire horde of knights. So what does that say? Well, it ended the era of chivalry. The knight was rendered not useless, but he could be defeated by a peasant with a longbow. So you can see how this also led us to being able to see the effects that were going on at this time so that we can answer our lesson question and we can really see the end of the medieval times. In the midst of a 100 Years' War, we have a story about Joan of Arc and Charles VII. Let me tell you this story really quick. Charles VII became France's monarch in 1429, and this was a direct result of a girl named Joan of Arc. She believed that she had been inspired by God and that God told her to get Charles crowned king, and that she needed to get him to the city of Reims where kings were crowned, and it was her job to get him there and to lead the army to provide him safe passage. So she accompanied Charles to Reims after she convinced him that this is what they needed to do. Now, it was a big deal because the city of Reims was in a very difficult spot to get to during this 100 Years' War. It was deep in enemy territory, but she convinced him he was meant to be king. She inspired the French army to fight, and these soldiers began to win battles, and they did get Charles successfully to Reims, where he was crowned king. Now, Joan of Arc, she led the French army to victories during that 100 Years' War. However, after she got Charles crowned king, she was captured. She was tried for witchcraft and heresy, being a heretic, being an enemy of the church. And she was actually executed in 1431. Charles didn't feel the need to save her. He'd already been crowned king, and now he wanted peace. He wanted the war to end. But she was captured by the English, who were very embarrassed because a teenage girl had beaten their armies. Girls during this time weren't supposed to lead armies. They weren't supposed to decide who was going to be king. So they burned her at the stake. Now, 20 years later, they decided that she should be exonerated and that they were wrong. They shouldn't have burned her at the stake and everything was all right. But it was a little late for excuses considering that she'd already died 20 years earlier. Now, some of the other effects of this 100 Years' War. The conflict had big impacts on both countries, France and England. It destroyed much of France. It strengthened monarchies, and it created standing armies. Now, this was important because remember that it took that power away from those lords and the knights. The people didn't need individuals protecting them because their nations had these large standing armies that would now fight for them. Also, it increased nationalism, the sense of pride that one has for their own country. And it ended English claims to French land. We can see on a timeline how periods of increased turmoil can all work together to bring about the end of an era. If you look at this timeline, you can see some of the things that we've been talking about. Here's the famine, immediately followed by the 100 Years' War, and that's interrupted by the plague. And if we look outside of this time period, or not time period, if we look outside of this timeline, we can also see other things that were going on, like the Crusades being fought, and the Great Schism ends, which was a conflict between two different papacies. We can see how all of these conflicts work together and they can bring an end to an entire era.